Hey everyone, Tim here. I just felt like I wanted to discuss something and share some thoughts on the topic of content creation and specifically analytical content creation. I figured a video would be a little more engaging than a blog post. So what I want to talk about is how you come up with content ideas and the difficulty of as an analytical content creator. I think especially coming up with what to write about and how to write about it, what kind of angles to approach it from. So I want to take a quick look at some of the kind of analytical templates that I often use that maybe you can use to build your ideas onto, and then maybe more importantly, a discussion of my favorite analytical template and why it's my favorite. So some of the I'm going to start kind of like less complexity, going up to more complexity. Some of the different templates you can use is what I call strengths and weaknesses analysis, or you can also call it like good or not analysis. This isn't so much content creation. This is usually more kind of conversational. This is when you take a player or a team and you kind of say, oh, they're good or they're not, or they're good at X, they're bad at Y. You get a lot of this on social media when you're just discussing it with people or just kind of talking about a team. This to me is, it's useful to have, and it kind of starts off conversations, but it's obviously less ideal because it doesn't usually get very deep. And also something to me is that it's usually hindsight analysis. So you're looking back at a team and seeing what they've done so far. They just played a game and they did this poorly. Okay, great. You were able to notice something that other people didn't, but that's hindsight based. So there's not really much risk to this analysis or much burden of observation on it, unless you're going, digging really deep into they're good at this and starting to get into why. But that's in getting into it a bit of a different content template at that point. Also, when you're talking about just kind of good or not or strengths and weaknesses, it sometimes limits the amount of context that is involved in the conversation, which is really important if you want to get a little deeper and start creating really in-depth analytical content. So that's a kind of strengths and weaknesses. That's not really so much content; it's just conversation. Then you get into there's another template, lists and comparisons. This is the kind of thing you see a lot and are seeing right now ahead of the League of Legends World Championships. You get power rankings, you get best players lists, these kinds of things, or you just take a couple of players, a couple of teams, you compare them and say which is better. Reddit loves them. The audience in general loves them. They generate a lot of clicks, a lot of views. But I think something to be very careful about is that the value of creating lists and comparisons content has to be in the discussion, not in the list itself. Anybody can make a list, but if you can't back up your list, then there's not really much point to it. So that's why, for example, with the Score Esports, we put out our power rankings the other day. I right away kind of jumped into the Reddit thread and wanted to kind of give people the chance to question my rankings, and I could discuss why I put certain teams in certain places, that kind of thing. And then I know, so Kelsey Moser as well just put out a video explaining some of her choices and why she put them there. So that's the real value to me as an analytical content creator. It's the discussion that's really what matters. Lists and comparisons to me are a bit overused because they are so popular and they generate clicks. They're very easy to engage with. They generate a lot of discussion among the audience. They aren't always based on good analytical work, so I have some issues with them. But there's not to say that they're bad, but I think they have to be well supported, and if they're the only kind of content you're doing, maybe need to try to diversify a little bit. Another content template is I usually call them scouting reports, or you could call it a deep dive. Sometimes you can call it a profile. So this is when you take a player or a team and you break them down in a lot of detail. You take a player, you say, here's kind of the trajectory of their career. If you're doing more of a narrative approach, that's not quite necessarily analytical content, although there's a continuum there. You say, they struggle with doing this, and here's maybe what they've done to improve on it, or what the flow has been. You say they're really good at doing this other thing, and here's how they do it, or maybe you make comparisons to other people who are good at that. This is where you can bring in a lot of statistics or observations, bring in highlight clips. I really like scouting reports. I like to do them. They take a lot of time to do well. This is when you can't just look at the last few games that a player or a team has played and comment on those. You've got to understand the arc of their season, or if you're really getting into the large scale, you got to understand the arc of their career. So they're a lot of fun, and they're also hindsight based, just kind of like the strengths and weaknesses approach. So this is saying, here's what the player looks like right now, and that's always going to be based on what they've done so far. You're not necessarily looking forward to say, here's what they're going to do next, because You're just saying, here's the status of the player. You might talk about their potential a little bit. You can work that in there. So it's not to say that a scouting report has to be purely hindsight based, but that's what it's usually going to be built around. Another one that you get into that's very popular is predictions. These are also kind of like the strengths and weaknesses conversational approach. These are often pretty shallow. They're brief. They're very social media friendly or broadcast friendly on air content. You just take a couple of teams and you say who you think is going to win. It gets a little more interesting if you start to say, this team will win because, and then you start to talk about, why they win, why they're better than the other team or whatever their advantages are. This is where you move away from the hindsight-based analysis, and now you're looking forward. So you're looking at what's already happened and using that to predict the future, but you're talking about what's coming up next. You're not talking about what they've done so far. That's just kind of your evidence base, because it's always going to be the only evidence base we have. So those are a lot of the different templates, but there's one more template, and this one's my personal favorite, and I bring it out every now and then, is win conditions analysis. So what win conditions analysis is it's got some similarities with predictions, but it's not quite the same. It's when you take two teams and you say, if team one is going to win, here's how they're going to do it. They have to try to do this and this and this, and if they do those things successfully, that's what they're going to win. And if team two is going to win, then they've got to do these other things. And you are taking the two teams, putting them up against each other and saying, you're using their strengths and their weaknesses, you're using how they interact with each other, and you're talking about here's what each team has to do to win. You're not necessarily saying here's why this team will win, because they are going to do these things, but you're saying they have to try to do these things. And it's not just general things like, they have to try to win the early game, or they have to try to be better at team fighting. Like those are fairly general, and those might come into it, but you want to try to get a little more specific. Like if you're talking about winning the early game, well, they've got to make sure their bottom lane wins the early game, because that's a really important, they succeed when their bottom lane succeeds. They fail when their bottom lane fails. Top lane doesn't really matter. If they go even, that's great, but if they can lose in top lane, as long as they win in bottom lane, these kinds of things where you're talking about the interactions between the two teams. So I really like win conditions for many different reasons. First of all, like predictions, they're forward-looking. They're not hindsight-based. You're not talking about what they've done so far. You're talking about here's what they need to do next. They're obviously much more complex than strengths and weaknesses based. You are using their strengths and weaknesses, but you're interacting the two teams. You're not just saying, like, here are two teams, they both have strong bottom lanes, and they both will win if their bottom lanes win. Well, it depends on how they interact. Is the one bottom lane good at laning? The other bottom lane's really good at, letting the support roam, and they're really good at getting into the team fights or whatever. You have to start thinking about the interactions much more, say where each one is strong and how they are stronger or weaker in certain areas, and how those influence one another. So you get more opportunity because of that complexity to show your depth of understanding as an analyst, which is another reason I really like it. It's also a challenge because you can, if you aren't able to show a good depth of understanding, that your content isn't going to be very compelling, but that's a general challenge with any kind of content creation. I also like win conditions because they are, in my opinion, more engaging and conversational than predictions a lot of the time. When you're just making a prediction, then the only way someone can really engage with you is either they agree or they disagree. And they might challenge you, on whether they agree or they disagree, say if there's a conversation of predictions happening. But with win conditions, I think you can, because of the nuance in them and the interactions between the two teams, you can have more of an in-depth conversation about it than, oh, you think they're going to win, why do you think they're going to win? And that's really the only direction predictions can go. So, and because of that, with predictions, you kind of get forced to either debate the other person's opinion or reinforce their opinion by agreeing with them. With win conditions, I think you are immediately jumping into a conversation that is about, oh, you think this team, can win by doing this thing. Why do you think they can win by doing this thing? Don't you think the other team is able to counter it by doing this? And you've instantly, like from the very start, you've got a more complicated conversation going on. So you have to assume that you've got the time and the space to have that conversation, but assuming you do, that's a really good opportunity. I also like win conditions analysis because it focuses attention on the teams themselves, not on the analyst. You might like content that focuses attention on you as the content creator, and to a certain degree you have to build your brand and get yourself out there. But I like it when the content is about the teams themselves. A lot of the times when you're making a prediction, it's like, I'm saying team one is going to win. If they're right, if they do win, then I'm right. It does not make me look good. If they lose, I'm wrong. That makes me look bad. It's about me and my prediction. Was I right or not? When you're talking about win conditions, this isn't about you outside of the fact that if your discussion of the win conditions and your analysis there is intelligent and compelling, then it makes you look good. But you're discussing the teams, and it doesn't matter who's discussing the teams because it's about the content and the conversation, not the people having the conversation and how well they put themselves out there. I also like the way that a win conditions conversation gives respect to both teams. When you're making a prediction, say it's a mismatch in some ways, even if it's not a huge mismatch, there's a clearly favored team. Well, everybody ends up predicting the favored team. Say you got 3 or 4 people making predictions, or even if it's just the one of you, and you predict the one team, and then you say, well, they're a much better team. They're going to win. That's you kind of. It's not that you're disrespecting the team that's going to lose, but you don't end up discussing the team that's going to lose too much unless you intentionally direct the conversation there. But if you are discussing win conditions, what does each team need to do if they are going to win? Right away, you're giving respect to both teams as having a chance to win. Looking back at it, for example, say the KT versus Samsung finals of the LCK regionals, people making predictions on who's going to win that, and everybody says, KT is beating Samsung every time. There's no chance KT is going to lose. Well, that's not much of a conversation, and it turned out to be wrong. But if you talk about, why is this team going to, what does this team need to do in order to win, not just why is KT going to win? Well, because they've won every time in the past. If you're talking about, well, what does Samsung need to do to beat them? Now you have an instantly more engaging conversation. You're respecting Samsung's ability to be good enough to win, even if they haven't showed it in the past. And I just think having that structure to the conversation where you're giving credit to both teams rather than crediting one team and discrediting the other one in order to kind of further your prediction, I find that more interesting, personally. And then finally, I think win conditions is really interesting because it's the closest thing we get as content creators to how professional coaches and analysts are required to think. When you are preparing your team to go into a match, you don't go into it thinking, are we going to win or not? With the predictions approach, you are thinking about strengths and weaknesses, but in a much more nuanced way. But what you're really thinking about is, what do we need to do to win? We need to do, these 3 things are the main things we need to focus on. And if we do those 3 things, we'll have a really good chance to win. That's the way a coach is going to think while they're preparing their team. And I think having that chance in your content to think in the same way and think about it from both sides of the match is really interesting, and it gives you a chance to kind of put yourself in those shoes rather than predictions based or making lists or the scouting reports is also kind of part of a similar way to a coach thinks, but I think this is more kind of putting yourself in their shoes, which can be pretty fun to do. So, I've been making a lot of conversations between win conditions analysis, predictions analysis, which a lot of comparisons there in making it seem like, one is a lot better than the other. I think they both have their place. And in fact, I think they pair together very well. So you're on broadcast and you want to talk about a match that's coming up. You can talk about the win conditions. Okay, here, this person on the desk can talk about what does this team need to do to win. The other person talks about what that team needs to do to win. But a weakness of win conditions analysis is that it doesn't really wrap it up to talk about which team is favored and why, and give kind of set expectations for what is most likely to happen. So if you pair that into predictions analysis and you say, okay, we've talked about the 3 main win conditions for each team. Now, who does each person think is actually going to win? And then you can talk a little about why, and you've set the basis for why they're going to win. Well, they need to do these 3 things, and they're super good at those 3 things. And the other team needs to do these 3 things, but, they've struggled to get this one done, so they might not be able to do it this time. So I think pairing win conditions analysis with predictions, if you've got the space to take your win conditions discussion and go really deep on a scouting report side, like, you can overlap a lot of these in different ways, but those are kind of the reasons why I really like doing win conditions articles. You could see one I did for the EU finals a while back, and I'm sure I'll bring it out again while Worlds is going on, probably for the bracket stages, not so much the group stage. But hopefully that is interesting you, just maybe partly if you're a content creator, to see like, oh, I've never thought about doing a scouting report article, or I've never thought about doing a win conditions article, or a video where I discuss both sides of a matchup and what they need to do to win. Maybe it gives you some ideas, and maybe it's also hopefully just interesting to see the way I think when I'm coming up with some kind of analytical content that I want to produce, and what some of the options are that I go through. So hopefully you found that interesting, and let me know in the comments what you think.